Picture for a moment a wheelchair-bound elderly guy parked in the center of a common room like so many others in assisted living facilities across the country. His name is Henry. He sits stooped over, gazing blankly at his own hands on the tray table, as staff, people, and other residents swirl and chat around him. He doesn't recognize his adult daughter when she arrives and greets him. She has to touch him before he even responds. Henry's caregivers explain that he's pretty much like that all the time, sitting like a statue with his head on his chest. Then someone slips a set of headphones over Henry's ears, and it's as if they have turned on a switch. Henry's feet start slapping the floor to the jazz and gospel of his youth. His eyes widen, and he lets out this high, quavering, tuneless note. Emotions move across his face like weather. When they take the headphones off, Henry is downright chatty. Words pour out of him. He talks about his number one artist, Cab Calloway, and he starts scatting some old Calloway tune. The music, he says, gives me a feeling of love, romance. You've got beautiful music here, beautiful. I feel the band of love, of dreams. His eyes are quick and free, and his long fingers spider the air as he speaks. I witnessed this transformation in a documentary called Alive Inside, about the power of music to fight depression and memory loss. That's what's happening to Henry. The soundtrack of this man's younger days literally gives him back himself. To me, it's the perfect metaphor for what the resurrection of Jesus offers to its witnesses and celebrants. Take the Apostle Peter in today's gospel. You remember Peter, the rock on whom Jesus founds the church? Yeah, Peter has had a pretty mixed record up until now. He's the first to call Jesus the Messiah, but then he falls asleep in all the crucial moments. Jesus' transfiguration on the mountaintop, Jesus' hour of despair at Gethsemane. At the Last Supper, Peter vows he will go with Jesus to prison and to death. But then barely 25 verses later, he abandons and denies his Lord 3 times. The guy's well-intentioned, but a tad flighty. It's like he keeps losing touch with his essential self. He keeps getting hijacked by cowardice or overenthusiasm or ambition. Like all the male disciples, he keeps forgetting who he really is. Then comes the first day of the week in today's gospel reading. The 11 apostles are still hiding out in fear and trembling when the women burst in to announce that Jesus is risen. They, in their fear and misogyny, dismiss the report as an idle tale, a clear sign they are not in touch with their true selves, except for Peter. Maybe for the first time ever, Peter actually listens. For the first time since he dropped everything to follow Jesus, Peter takes a courageous action, an unselfish action. Risking his own life, Peter runs to the tomb. He bears witness. He believes. And from then on, As Luke's sequel to his gospel, the book of Acts, reports, Peter is changed. He preaches the gospel boldly, at great danger to himself. He heals the sick and restores life to the dead. He endures imprisonment and beatings. His words and his actions become aligned with that essential self, that indwelling Spirit of God. Friends, that's the promise of the resurrection. Like music in Henry's ears, it returns us to ourselves. Like the open tomb in Peter's eyes, it reminds us who God created and who Jesus calls us to be. Please note what the resurrection does not promise, outside of the Bible anyway. It does not promise an end to our suffering. It does not restore sight to the blind, does not remove sorrow from the heart of the bereaved, does not relieve chronic pain, or stem the tide of war, or cure mental illness, or reverse climate change, or battle online misinformation, or heal the terrible silence that adult children and parents can inflict on one another. The resurrection is not a magic trick. Despite the frantic buoyancy you may find in some churches, it is also not an antidepressant. It is not some kind of get out of suffering free card. It is a chance for us to reclaim ourselves. Our inherent beautiful spirits are indwelling God. It is a chance for us to remember who we are. But how does that actually work? Like, how do we actually do that? Well, imperfectly, for one thing. I can tell you that from my own experience. And as imperfectly as I do this, I can also say that fulfilling its promise in our own lives requires a spiritual practice. Call it resurrection consciousness. Resurrection consciousness means that however we understand what happened on that Easter day 2,000 years ago, we're called to treat it as a living event. We're called to find the mystery of it as it lives here and now. We're called to tune in to that which returns us to who we really are. The moments of peace with a spouse or loved one. The still small voice that urges us to speak up when we see something wrong. The gratitude that blooms when we shift our focus from what we lack to what we have been given. The urge to share, to give, to bring joy to others. And friends, how about the mere fact that given all we are putting it through, this worn out old world can still produce a feathered fuchsia sunrise, or a web of bare branches under quiet snow, or a spring day so brilliant and loamy and cacophonous with birdsong that it almost hurts. Life gives way to death, gives way to life. The sacred emerges in every season and every corner. There is something much wiser than any of us, something shaping cycles within cycles from which to draw our nourishment, something with the capacity to restore us to ourselves. In the year before the pandemic, the poet Ross Gay published a book that has done as much for my own practice of resurrection consciousness as any recent religious text. He called it the Book of Delights. a series of brief essays, journal entries really, derived from a project of trying to notice and record at least one thing that delighted him every day for a year. In the preface, Ross reports that the practice occasioned a kind of delight radar, a wonderful phrase, perhaps a secular phrase, for what we call resurrection consciousness. I felt my life to be more full of delight, Ross says, not without sorrow or fear or pain or loss, but more full of delight. I'm going to close with one of Ross's delights because it provides a particularly fitting how-to on cultivating resurrection consciousness, and because, when in doubt, quote someone who writes better than yourself. In this entry, Ross describes the first flower he planted in his garden, a lily, appropriately enough. Ross writes, I pray to it daily in the 4 to 6 weeks that it offers up its pinkish speckling by getting on my knees and pushing my face in, which, yes, is also a kind of kissing, as I tend to pucker my lips and close my eyes. And if you get close enough, you'd probably hear some minute slurping between us. And for some reason, I wish to deploy the verb drowning, which, in addition to being a cliche, implies a particular kind of death. And I will follow the current of that verb to suggest that the flower kissing, the moving so close to another living and breathing thing's breath, which in this case is that of the lily I planted 6 years ago, will in fact kill you with delight, will annihilate you with delight, will end the life you had previously led before kneeling here and breathing the breathing thing's breath. And the lily will resurrect you too. Your lips and nose lit with gold dust, your face and fingers smelling faintly all day of where they've been. Amen.